Hello, and welcome to Varn Vlog's Radical Engagements. I hope you're doing well today. We continue with Raymond Geuss's Not Thinking Like a Liberal, and we continue picking up on the lessons that he dealt with in his Catholic school upbringing in a Hungarian Catholic school in the 1950s. Last time we talked about the three views of authority as spelled out by his priest and teacher, but now we have to deal with what authority means and what it means to be without it. You can see this general Greek difficulty with the whole idea of authority by looking at the specific case of Plato. Plato argued in the Republic that philosophers could become experts in the good. And the good is capitalized. And we have a footnote, so we'll go and check that out. It's just the Republic. Okay. They could come to know all about it, to be, as one might say, authorities on the good, in the same way that geometers were authorities on the properties of triangles. He also thought that because they knew the good, philosophers could rule the city. Asterisk, this is Varn talking. In fact, he literally thought the good was the same thing as geometers knowing triangles. It's actually an interesting analogy. A lot of the logic in Plato, in addition to being highly esoteric and sometimes probably quasi-religious and even magical, a lot of the philosophy in Plato is tied directly to geometric assumptions about reality. Hence the focus on things like forms. All right, back to the text. We might formulate this as their epistemic authority ought to give them political authority. However, what Plato actually says is something more like this. Unless philosophers rule as kings, and that means that political power and philosophical power combined, there will be no cessation of evils for the cities. And I'm just going to note here, because I cannot read Greek. It's cited in the original Attic Greek. The beginning of understanding of our modern phenomenon of authority lies with just how far out our, in quotation marks, formulation departs from the Greek one. First of all, rule as king, basolosantai, I don't know how to say that, is an exceedingly deadpan and disillusioned version of have political authority. Plato drives the point home by adding it is political power, daimonis, like dynamic. I do know what that is. And philosophy must coincide. Second, the modern formulation is clogged with oughts in a way that the Greek one is not. It ought to be the case that those who know the good ought to be obeyed. Finally, we get to some Marxism. Lenin once said that a revolution is the most authoritarian thing in the world, but I think that is incorrect. Footnote. Always check out the footnotes just as a practice of reading. Vladimir Lenin, State and Revolution. Perhaps revolutions have to be violent, but, as Krieger kept saying, force, coercion, and violence could accompany authority in various complex ways, establishing it, reinforcing it, elaborating on it, facilitating it, and creating conditions within which it might flourish. But they are not all the same thing. The Greeks had a perfectly good grasp of force and violence, via kratos, etc., and in the role in the human and divine affairs, and a clear notion of what is stasis, turmoil, static, civil war. Was one party rising up, killing its opponents or driving them into exile, and reordering the city according to its own taste. Thucydides describes the process with some subtlety and in great detail. The Greeks also know a very clear notion of persuasion, pietho, as an alternative of the use of force, but for them, forced persuasion constituted a strict dichotomy. However, the whole point of authority was that it was to be a third thing, something that could not be identified with or reduced to either force, violence, or coercion, or to rational or irrational forms of persuasion. In the idealized case, the policeman neither reasons with me until he convinces me to move, nor does he simply hit me on the head until I do so. He tells me to do it, perhaps citing his authority. It was this purported third thing that the Greeks found impossible to conceptualize, so that Dio Cassio thought that despite their acquaintance with and numerous reflections on the use of force, and for instance, the more theoretically inclined historians such as Thucydides, the power of persuasion and the rhetorical tradition of Gorgias, and the philosophical argumentation in, for instance, I don't know, Plato, the I don't knows me, the Greeks lacked a concept of authority, meaning the abstraction of both reason and force into a new third thing. That's what authority is. And I guess what Geuss is getting at here is perhaps there's forms of violence that are necessary to human life and political struggle, but do not actually equate to the establishment of authority. Just imagine Kriegler invited us a world where the very idea of normative authority is absent. And this was the Greeks, who did geometry, philosophy, history, and politics very well without it. Thank you very much. That's in the text. And in addition, of course, wrote epics, tragedies, epigrams, odes, comedies, dialogues, elegies, satyr plays, idols, and other things, sculpted statues, painted pottery, built temples, designed cities, and sailed around the whole Mediterranean, busying themselves with war, diplomacy, exploration, piracy, settlement, and trade. As a question mark, I do find it interesting that this in Kriegler's conception, and I guess in Geuss is not mentioning it, was all based on a massive slave population, both in the Spartan type, which was more brutal and direct and lived in direct fear of slave uprisings, and in the Athenian type. And moreover, that unlike Roman slavery, where slavery was often manumitted through work or being set free by your master upon death, or being allowed to keep earnings, and that's one of the interesting things about a lot of antique slavery, you were allowed to keep earnings, that Greek slaves often did not have a way out in the same way, and their slavery was actually closer to modern chattel slavery than the Roman model. Not to say that any of the slavery is good, and I don't want to romanticize antique slavery. You didn't want to be a slag mine slave. That was pretty much a death sentence. But it is interesting the differences in how manumission can happen. Whereas in like American chattel slavery, for example, your master can set you free, but there's really no way for you to earn your freedom. I just brought that up because while this is all true that Kriegler is putting it out, it's kind of based on this slave thing, and this is not being brought up at all. And it was in the Roman case too. I mean, while there was a decline in Romans' use of slaves, and I think the later empire, even the Republican period, was a high slave-based economy. Words could, of course, be extracted from their original context and formalized so that their use continue long after their original set of institutions in which they had some sense have disappeared. But in the case of authority, the extraction had not shown itself to be conceptually especially fortunate, and the concept remained irredeemably woolly and prone to generate confusion. So, of course, there was no reason to eschew its use in many contexts in everyday life when it was essentially well connected to be perfectly comprehensible and useful, but no theoretical weight should ever be put on it. I find that an interesting thing, and I don't know that Geuss actually wrestles with what that implies. Like, the Greek conception as being presented by Kriegler and Thucydides here is that normativity is lacking. There is just direct violence or persuasion. There is force or charisma, or argumentum et baculum, and ethos. And that's an interesting conception, and I'm not sure I totally believe it in the case of the Greek world, but I do find it interesting if you strictly translate Plato. A lot of oughts fall away. We add the oughts. They're not actually there. This is something to think about when we think about what liberalism is up against. It'll come up again when we think about like conceptions of rights and Hobbes, who has natural rights, unalienable rights, but they're all based on the right to promise and the right to life, and mainly only go from there and don't presuppose a whole lot of other moral constraints that like Locke or Rousseau add back in. And we have to think about authority and what authority means and what this third case is. Now, for someone like Hobbes, and this is beyond the scope of this text, but it's something interesting to bring up. What authority is either the promise out of self-preservation, as in men agree to it, or the promise of a sovereign that has taken it by conquest and granted you your life, and thus in granting your life, you promise to be their subject. And it's as simple as that, because you have the absolute right to self-defense in life. I mean, Hobbes even has it where, like, he says, you know, analogies to slavery are invalid. You either have direct slavery or it isn't, but he does actually say, like, for example, you always have the right to run from the police, even if the state's after you, even if the state is right to try to punish you, you have the right to resist in that scenario. It's a very, actually, Hobbesian philosophy is actually a little bit more strange than a lot of people realize. What Hobbes does is interesting, but one of the things that you find there is authority is just based on the promise, the contract, right? It is not based on any other derisions of natural law, such as dignity, equality, etc. Although Hobbes does actually think people are equal, and that's why there's so much violence, believe it or not. Now, I'm not fully convinced of Hobbes' conception of the world, but I actually am in admiration of how few things he sneaks in. And it's interesting because in this conceptions, Hobbes is actually kind of arguing against these abstracted authorities, the authority of ought, which are provisional in all society, that later contractarian theses will try to put in, the more liberal ones. I had a debate with Colin Drum about whether or not Hobbes is a liberal. Colin says all liberals are post-Hobbesian. I think secularization, methodological individualism, belief in natural equal right, and natural equality between men and women, and actually also natural equality between races, believe it or not. He thinks he has some very culturalist issues with other people. It's not to say there isn't racism there, but he's actually not a defender of slavery, and he's not a defender of, which Locke is, by the way, and he's not a defender of inherent inequality between man and woman, although he thinks that basically the social order is held together in sovereignty in a way that makes that somewhat irrelevant. But these are things that we associate with liberalism. Colin says, you know, but he doesn't believe in freedom at all, and he actually comes to completely illiberal conclusions about the unitary sovereign, the inability of there be authority above the sovereign to judge the sovereign on, other than just enough force to go the other way, which Hobbes doesn't want, because he basically is writing in the context of the English Civil War and trying to make sure that stuff didn't happen again. He's not so much defending the feudal order as actually making an argument for an absolute monarch to stop wars, civil wars, or social wars, etc. Now, I bring all this Hobbes stuff up because it's on my mind right now, because it actually is a different conception of authority. What these kind of more, this normative authority, which descends from force, but is not force, and descends from persuasion, but is not persuasion. That concept of authority is not as articulated at Hobbes as it would be in, say, someone like, I don't know, Locke or Montesquieu, where separation of powers and all that grant authority, and the authority is from the sovereignty of the people, and while that sovereignty can be violated, that actually causes the loss of authority because of some new judgment. Colin takes issue with the concept of political freedom. I'm not as willing to go as far as him, but it's important in this context because authority is a question. And one of the things that you will notice about the Greek thing as being described here by Geuss, and what I'm describing in Hobbes, is that in the Greek case, there is no really conception of authority as a third thing other than force or persuasion. And in the Hobbesian conception, such normativity is reduced to like, well, we have rights that are inalienable. You give most of them up except for your right to life, which you absolutely cannot give up, because it negates you as a subject, and your rights to physical movement, which he takes very literally. And then lastly, and beyond those rights, all other rights are metaphors, and based on this, on outside notions of authority that are unjustifiable, according to Hobbes. Now, I find that interesting because that's a reduction of the concept of authority, actually, and assumes methodological individualism, a whole lot of things that I don't necessarily assume, but I find interesting. And I find a lot of answers to Hobbes in the English and French liberal social contractarian thesis to be slightly unsatisfying, frankly. And that's because it has vaguer notions of authority tied into it. Now, I would have to go back and read Hobbes carefully to see if this ties in directly. Maybe Colin could do that for me in the context of our agreement and disputation. But it's interesting to think about that and the concept of the Greek world. But also, like, anyone who actually knows the Greek world better than I do. I mean, I know a lot about the classics, but I'm not, like, I can't read Attic Greek or Koine Greek, you know? So I can fiddle through it with a translator, and I've got lexicons, but it's hard. Anyway. And it's not something I have time to do. So if you know more about this and maybe think this is an oversimplification based off a few religious texts that maybe are unfounded, like Dio Cassio, then comment. Anyway, like and subscribe. We're going to continue these radical engagements. There's a lot more Geuss to go through. We're getting more into the Marxist part. I'm actually interested in how much of this is based on Catholic social thought, and particularly non-Thomistic kind of Central European Catholic social thought. So if any of you are like, I don't know, some kind of like red Catholic or something who watches my show, and I know there's a few of you, you can also comment if this is different from your conceptions. All right. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, blah, blah, blah. I have a Patreon. There's stuff there. Thank all my patrons. Have a great day. And keep on reading so that you can use what you learn.